was the situation. They were sending great numbers of troops into Cambodia, preparing for what is called the Tet Offensive of that year. We take this action not for the purpose of expanding the war into Cambodia, but for the purpose of ending the war in Vietnam. I do it again, I do it again, I do it again.
It's just a dead country.
Fighting the Vietnam War, and if we have to use the Khmer Rouge as a pawn in that, we'll use them.
I do it again, 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 I do it again.
Well, howdy, y'all. Welcome back to the Deprogram. Joining us today and collecting his third appearance challenge coin, I think. His friend of the show and one half of Blowback, Brendan James. Brendan and Noah swooped in like a few years ago and just casually dropped one of the most polished and engaging podcasts ever, in my opinion. And Brendan is with us today to talk about their shiny new 5th season. So, Brendan, say hi to the lovely people at home and tell us a little bit more about who you are and what Blowback is all about.
Howdy, everybody. It's Brendan James. I am, as you just said, JT, the co-host of Blowback, a podcast I do with my good friend Noah Colwyn. And it's a history show. It's a docuseries. Our first season was about the Iraq War. We went on to do a bunch of seasons about the Cuban Missile Crisis, Korean War, the long saga of Afghanistan. We've come on this show to talk about some of those. And this season is sort of, it's sort of in a way been in demand for a while. It's about Cambodia, but it's also about sort of the chain reaction of the Vietnam War. Because, of course, the story about Cambodia and Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger's invasion and bombing of Cambodia, which led to a whole host of things that changed, the 20th century. It was an outgrowth of the Vietnam War. And we've always kind of avoided the Vietnam War because it's so ubiquitous. And it's the one war Americans love talking about because many of the people who marched against it grew up and became respectable people and, gave it its due time in movies and media and all that. But I think we're approaching it hopefully from a bit of a place of freshness for a general audience. And we go into, how this kind of constellation of conflicts begins to appear out of this one war.
Just out of curiosity, before we get to the meat of the season, how do you guys choose your topics? What's that process look like?
I usually tell Noah what I want to do and he obeys me.
This is why he's not on the pod at the moment. You've got him like duct taped to the wall in the background so he can't contribute.
He was dying to be on, but I said, no, that's not happening today. No, he's busy. We have to do all the press ourselves. Mm-hmm. So, he's off doing shows and I'm off doing shows and we'll see where we meet in the middle. But no, sometimes it's natural. I remember coming out of the Iraq season, because that was our first time we thought we would actually do another season, given that we weren't sure how everyone would even like the first one. And we just kind of both knew, I think it was Cuba. We just thought it'd be fun to go back in time, because Iraq was obviously a relatively modern conflict. And that Cuba was like, there was something about it that drew us with the way we thought of the show and how we could treat it. And then Korea, I think I might have made that call. I do think I made the call for Afghanistan as well. It wasn't just because we had just withdrawn, Biden had withdrawn, but it didn't hurt with Afghanistan. Yeah, there's always some kind of connection to the real world or the real world too. All this stuff's real, but to the current day. Yeah. That may inform, why certain topics feel right, but sometimes it's subconscious. I think we just commune with the podcast spirits. And,
vibes-based decision making. That's the best way to do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in a kind of very dark way. It's good that you have so many things to choose from, but it's fucked up that you have so many things to choose from, thanks to empire and everything that we'll get into throughout this episode and that we got into during the previous one. So just the fact that you have to sit down and think, okay, which one out of these horrible, fucked up interventions do we talk about is already so, I'm going to say it, and it's a cliche, but it's true, so fucking dystopian at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's a strange feeling for people, because look, we stumbled into a great thing. People love the show. We have lovely listeners who have, made it so this can be our full-time job. There's nothing really better than that. But it is odd to make something that people pump their fist at and say, I can't wait for this, and it's a tale of human suffering every single time. Yeah. Because, it's I try to make sure we don't get too flippant.
Yeah.
About that. But we're just trying to tell stories, that are compelling and that may not be found elsewhere. And, that's a great thing to be able to do. But it's a weird one. And also when people say, I can't wait for this, it's going to make me so angry. It's just an odd thing to be like, I can't wait for you to get upset listening to the thing I made. But, Look, that's how it goes.
All these horrible war crimes and interventions and stuff, that's the price we got to pay to put the content in the trough, all right? This is the slot machine.
Absolutely. That's how it works. The real war, the content war.
The posting wars, we're all in the trenches. We're on the front lines serving you, dear listener. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right in, because I think there's a lot of stuff we want to get to, because like you said, Cambodia is kind of the overlooked portion of that era. One thing that you guys excel at is setting the stage for each season of the show. Most listeners will be aware of the major events that transpired during the Vietnam War era, but they probably won't know much about the period of French colonialism that preceded it. So could you tell us a little bit more about how France came to control Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and their goals in the region?
Sure. Just a little bit maybe first about the Khmer Empire that came and went before France arrived, because we got to go to Cambodia and Vietnam this season. That was another sort of novel element for us about this season. Is I had been to Cuba after the second season, and we'd both been in the Middle East before, but this was the first time we sort of got to prepare material, having been in the country before we did the season. And so we went to Angkor Wat, which is the sort of complex of temples in the northwest of the country. It's a striking place to walk around and to spend time in, and it's the evidence of the sort of glorious Khmer Empire. The Khmer are the majority population of Cambodia. There are other, ethnic groups, which comes up in a grim way when you get to the Khmer Rouge years. There's ethnic Vietnamese, ethnic Chinese, distinct ethnic and religious Muslim population called the Chams. But the Khmer was the main group, and they ran from about the 9th century to the 15th, an empire that French archaeologists, funnily enough, later discovered, rivaled anything in the Greek or Roman world in its culture and social level. And you can see that in Angkor Wat. They were also a kind of water kingdom of sophisticated irrigation networks, much like Rome, which is kind of that cheat code for ancient civilizations that make it big. They did suffer a decline in the 15th century, and they had Vietnam to their east and Thailand to their west, sort of nibbling at their at their borders at that point. And it sort of just became a reality that by the time of French ascendancy, the Khmer Empire was now more like what we think of Cambodia today, a kind of small kingdom that was on the defensive and that was easy pickings for the French once they turned their attention to Indochina. Now, what is Indochina? A lot of your listeners probably know it's the trio of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And in the mid-19th century, these were kingdoms that were all kind of going through some crack-ups. Vietnam obviously has its own history, but with an assist from Catholic Spain, France moved in about the middle of the 19th century and took southern Vietnam. And this was a project of Louis Napoleon, Napoleon III, which I know you guys do a lot of theory stuff, so your listeners probably know about the 18th Brumaire, Marx's treatise on Louis. And he was really trying to compete with Britain for a proper French empire, and they made headway in Indochina. So they made deals with Imperial China, which was at that point was an empire on decline, and also the Kingdom of Siam, modern day Thailand. And so that's how they acquired Laos, was through basically it was a prize they got from Thailand after a protracted conflict. So, the French, they went in, they did not forget to force subjects to legalize the practice of Catholicism, which would eventually serve as a useful way to westernize, segments of the population, win commercial influence. And all throughout, there were revolts, in Vietnam, certainly, and Cambodia and Laos, although it became more organized in Vietnam. And that is because a key thing here is, like I said, Vietnam was always really the crown jewel. Rubber factories, a modern colonial system of government, proletarianization, the budding middle class, the kind of colonial, collaborator class and all that. And so Cambodia ended up being more of what they call a buffer state, real estate, basically, to keep Vietnam nice and snug from any regional rivals. And so while Vietnam was thrown into the industrial system and the class politics of the colonial/modern world, Cambodia was largely preserved as a rural traditional monarchy, which meant that a lot of the more modern revolutionary politics and forms of resistance weren't in Cambodia. And then when they did get there, they entered through Vietnam, which was of frustration to some Khmers. That they felt they were sort of dominated by Vietnam, which will come up.
All right, cool. Well, let's move on a little bit. I want to make sure we get to all these questions. The West, particularly the U.S., is notorious for making use of forces that will later become enemies when it suits their interests. Like Stalin was Man of the Year after World War II, and then he became and remains perhaps the greatest boogeyman in neoliberal mythology. The Allied powers also worked with the Viet Minh under good old Uncle Ho. Can you tell us a little bit about how that worked? Because from the outside, it seems a little odd at first, right?
Yes. Well, of course, the nice thing about World War II is that it was a battle of good and evil with no nuance whatsoever. And that makes things simple. But in reality, the relative convergence of the Allied forces and the local resistance to the French, which at that point was Vichy France, it worked out so that the Viet Minh were fighting the same enemy as the United States, much as Stalin was fighting the same enemy as the United States at that point, before we scooped up all those Nazis. And so the Viet Minh had the real prestige, in the struggle against originally just the Republic of France and then Vichy France. And then when the Japanese came in, Japan did a coup against the French in Indochina, who were their supposed allies in the Axis, in 1945, when things were really starting to, go south for the Axis. And the Japanese arguably ruled over the Indochinese places even more brutally. There was a famine from them, largely due to Japan appropriating all of the rice available, which caused about 1 million to 2 million people to die. But then, of course, good old Douglas MacArthur and, of course, the Chinese and the communists in Manchuria, they all stuck it to the Japanese. And that was when the Vietnamese resistance saw their moment to seize Hanoi. And so the Americans and the Viet Minh, they traded intelligence and support and shared the same goals up to that point.
Now, as things progressed and, come 1949, Cambodia was, I think they had always been a little bit distrustful of influence from Vietnam, perhaps a little bit spooked by their industrialization. But there was also a developing intellectual current of students who traveled to Paris, right? What can you tell us about the Khmer Students Association and some of its members?
This was the moment that the Khmer Rouge came into their intellectual sort of ideological state. Philip Short, Pol Pot's biographer, wrote that the Khmer Rouge movement wasn't really born out of Stalinism or Maoism or trips to Russia or China, but or even totally out of Khmer nationalism, although that was a huge part of it. But it was really shaped by Paris. Now, of course, Ho Chi Minh and other leaders had studied in France. I believe Ho Chi Minh co-founded the French Communist Party. But it's around this time that the future Khmer Rouge, which were the next generation of Cambodian communists, who were relatively privileged for rural Cambodia, they cut their teeth in France and they read their Lenin and their Mao, and they came back to Cambodia in a few years to get involved in clandestine politics with a more esoteric style, combined with the deep resentment of Vietnamese domination, of Indochinese resistance, because the peace deal that happened after the French War was basically that the Cambodian communists were cut out completely. They weren't strong enough. They were nowhere near as strong or organized or powerful as the Communist Party in Vietnam were. And so Sihanouk, Prince Sihanouk, who's really a character in this season and the sort of permanent fixture in Cambodian politics in all these different ways, he wheeled and dealed and got a bloodless independence for Cambodia. And he went about smashing anyone else who had any influence in Cambodia, which included the Cambodian communists, many of whom went up to Hanoi with the Vietnamese after the war. So the Cambodian communism was kind of neutralized in a large way by this peace conference. And the Khmer Rouge always saw that as a betrayal, basically. Moscow told the Vietnamese to organize everything into one party because Indochina was one unit, as far as the colonialists were concerned. But, these individual nationalities didn't necessarily feel that way. So there's a deep, visceral xenophobia that over time forms in the Khmer Rouge that come out of these Paris study abroad programs that becomes very destructive.
So, yeah, you mentioned Prince Sihanouk, and he's a fascinating figure because he started out pretty young. He was ascended not by his own merit necessarily to power. Can you tell us a little bit more about him and how that started?
He was installed by Vichy France, and that's not.
But before you continue, why Prince though? Why Prince? How did he get to call himself Prince? Was there a direct connection between his genealogy and ancient leaders of the Khmer, or as usual, we send our guy, we say, because Europe defines who is installed by God and who is not. Now he is literally a deity in personified, because, for example, my part of the world, they did that very often in Bulgaria and Albania, et cetera, et cetera. They would just send over a random German or a French guy, not saying that this particular prince was German or French, et cetera, but they would send him over and they're like, now he's your king. They would marry to an actual local, and then they would hope that would kind of create a new line that gets to rule this particular place. So basically what I'm asking, why Prince? Why wasn't he, a liberal democratic president introducing a modern way of life to Cambodia, et cetera, but he was, a monarch?
Yeah, he was the son of the previous king. But there was a court, intrigue between two different parts of the royal lineage. And later on, the other prince, Sirik Matak, will bust out a coup against Prince Sihanouk with the cooperation of American friends. But in the French period, he was just this little guy who liked ice cream and going to the movies. And the French thought he would be pliant. He was a prince. He was a royal. There was no kind of even Potemkin appearance of a liberal, middle-class, sort of colonial collaborator party. It was an untouched traditional monarchy. And the French picked the winners and the losers in that family, and they picked Sihanouk. But he proved himself quite cunning at a young age. It wasn't right when he was appointed. It was about 10 years later that he got that deal for independence. And what he managed to do was always change hats whenever it suited him for the rest of his life. He was an incredibly eccentric figure. I've had more fun with him than pretty much any other character in our show, because he was a head of state. He was a royal. When he thought he could control politics better as a politician, he abdicated the throne. He was no longer king. And then he just became a politician. And then when he got bored of that, he went back to being the father of the nation. He was a musician. He wrote and performed music and released records. We play some of them on the show. He made films, especially when things weren't going so well. Before the coup, he started to just kind of hang out away from politics and make movies with his cabinet. The chief of staff was like an actor in one of his movies. He was awesome in a lot of ways. Yeah. Now, of course, politically he was responsible for some good and some bad.
Yeah.
But he was quite a character, and so his journey to switch sides to whatever made sense at the time was, you could look at it as opportunistic, which it no doubt was, but it was also a big part of how Cambodia could remain neutral for as long as it did.
He's a fascinating figure. Like I was listening to, dear listeners, I got to listen to some of these episodes early, so enjoy that. Know that I'm better than you. But yeah,
the podcaster privilege instilled,
The bit about him and his cabinet making movies, that was just so eccentric and bizarre. I love that. How much do you think he actually cared about progress, or at least strength and stability in Cambodia, and how much of that was just kind of him, wanting to be the guy?
It's interesting. I think he no doubt had this kind of sort of paternalistic style. I mean, how could he not? He was a prince, he didn't revolutionize Cambodia, but he did very good on education. He built a lot of schools because the French neglected the education system in building up Cambodia. In Vietnam, you want to colonize a place, you set up a bunch of schools, education. It's not that it's a bad thing, obviously, but it's toward the imperial designs you have on the place that you want people to be. You want a certain segment of the population to be more educated. But they didn't do that in Cambodia, the French, because they just, again, it was more just real estate that they needed. So the Prince was good about that. But in a lot of ways, he was corrupt, and it was, still very much just a rural agrarian economy that was made to love him. And people did like him. He was very popular. Even when he was out of power, some people in the countryside, deep into the countryside, thought he was still in charge. So I think he had an interest in Cambodia being stable and hopefully prosperous. I don't think he was like a total con man. And actually, eventually, he clearly did get sick of ruling. I don't think he really wanted to rule. He was really a figurehead after the coup, forever after. He was a figurehead for the Khmer Rouge at one point. He was a figurehead in the 90s after everything passed. But very, very fascinating guy. He actually backed gay marriage in the early 2000s. Before any American head of state did, by the way. So he was not like this kind of figure from the past who was a total relic of an older era. He had progressive tendencies.
Just an eccentric, just a dude who rocks. I love it.
Yeah.
So let's move on to Cambodia in the war for a minute. I want to talk about Cambodian neutrality, because North Vietnamese fighters had been using the eastern border region of Cambodia as kind of like a safe zone where they could regroup or retreat from South Vietnamese attacks or store weapons, stuff like that. And then when the U.S. decided to expand its war into Cambodia to try to squash these pockets of resistance, how did that affect the neutrality thing?
Yeah, that was the balancing act that Sihanouk had to achieve.
Yeah,
because he was betting on the Vietnamese for a while. Of course, that ended up being the correct bet. Although before the Vietnamese won the war, he had been knocked out of power. But he allowed the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, essentially, to make use of the border areas. He didn't love it, but he obviously was trying to do a very tough thing, which is stay out of one of the most immensely destructive conflicts of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And he also had good relations with, at that period, Hanoi. and he had really good relations with communist China. He was an anti-communist at home, but he was beloved in Beijing and in North Korea, in Pyongyang. His two best friends on the world stage were, the Chinese leadership and Kim Il-sung personally. And in fact, in later years when he was vacationing or just kind of, like I said, stepping away from any powerful role, he would go to Pyongyang and be in a mansion there, or have his mansion and his personal chefs in Beijing.
Wow.
A charmed life.
Yeah.
Except for some real nasty stuff that happened to his family under the Khmer Rouge. But anyway, he balanced it for a while, but eventually the Americans in 1969 under Richard Nixon inaugurated a secret bombing campaign called Operation Menu. And it was a series of raids, breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, supper, dessert. And this was a menu designed by Henry Kissinger himself. And that was really tacitly, I guess, Sihanouk approved, but he wasn't consulted on it. It was going to happen. So if he had wanted to make a stink about it, he thought, now my country's being bombed, but just as I didn't love the Vietnamese on my border, I don't love the U.S. bombing my border, but I have to try to stay as out of the shit as possible here. That did not end up paying off for him, because a year later he was cooed.
So the latter half of the season features a left-wing specialty that we talk about a lot here on the show, and that is leftist infighting. The Khmer Rouge remains a big, scary question mark for a lot of people interested in socialist ideas. So enlighten us. What was their deal? What was up with the Khmer Rouge? Who were they, and why did their project end up the way that it did?
And why did Elon Musk lead it? It's very strange.
Yeah, he does look like him, doesn't he?
All right. A question mark. That's interesting. I didn't realize history had not answered that question.
Well, as a newbie coming to left-wing ideas, I was like, hey, these guys are communists. Well, isn't that evil? Isn't that, is this what all communism is? That sort of thing.
Yeah, they were they were an odd bunch. We've talked about them a little bit already, about how they sort of gestated in that period of betrayal in the Cambodian nationalist view. I've seen a couple of times on Twitter people saying they weren't even really communist. I mean, that would have been news to them. They certainly considered themselves in this period to be communist. Later on, it gets interesting, but they had a very, very unique idea of what that meant, and even their closest ally, which was China. China liked Sihanouk, as I said, but eventually, in part due to U.S. policy shit-canning him, eventually the only game in town to oppose the pro-American regime was the Khmer Rouge. And so the Vietnamese and the Khmer Rouge worked together. The Viet Cong really actually led most of the fighting in Cambodia until the very end of the war. The Khmer Rouge were usually the backup squad. But they did learn from the Viet Cong about how to do guerrilla fighting. But quietly, they did not trust the Viet Cong, and their internal party communiques are full of terms like steadfast independence and, never being told what to do by these other quote unquote comrades. And what I was about to say is even China, which was their only benefactor for many years and their only trade partner, they didn't really think they were communist in the proper sense. But they didn't care at that point. The Chinese needed them as a geopolitical ally against the Vietnamese, which we can get to in a bit. I mean, we go into this on the show. There's so many things you can talk about, but every revolution up to that point in the 20th century, particularly, the big ones, Soviet and Russian, I suppose you would say, the Russian, the Chinese, and Vietnamese revolutions, you have to navigate how a overwhelmingly agrarian country is going to be a project for a proletarian revolution. And I think you could probably pinpoint many of the defects and failures of those revolutions, such as they were, to that problem of that ultimate mismatch. Everyone knows it was supposed to happen in Western Europe, where there was already a industrial economy that would allow for a pure proletarian revolution, but then it ends up happening on the periphery of the industrial world, right? So that was a problem all these places had, and they all had their different theories. And Maoist, of course, was a very popular school at that point to square that circle. The Khmer Rouge just took all of those systems of justification and just ramped them up. Mm-hmm. So the ideas of revolutionary consciousness, mind over matter, if you will, of changing, your consciousness no matter what the situation is, that became far more important than organizing the working class. Mm-hmm. And actually dealing with real workers. In fact, they couldn't make headway with the small working class that were in Cambodia, and started to consider them enemies, and said that they had all been infiltrated, rather that the working class had been infiltrated by enemy agents, probably Vietnamese, KGB, CIA. And so it was a truly, some have characterized it as just a peasant rebellion, a violent peasant rebellion, rather than any kind of truly socialist project. There's so much you could go into here that we do in the season, but they're an odd bunch, is what I would say.
And regardless of their ideological beliefs, whatever they believe themselves to be, it seems like it was, at its very base, heavily animated by xenophobia, fear of neighbors, or at least distrust of neighbors. And how much would you say that whole movement was directed from above by those students who studied in Paris? Because Pol Pot was one of them, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Paul became general secretary in the late 60s, I believe. And he was the first among equals. He had several associates that were very important. It wasn't just a one. These things are never, even if it's a dictatorship, there's usually, it's not one guy, obviously. You've got your Berias and your Molotovs and all that. And in this case, there was Yang Seri, who was really the foreign minister. He was the guy who would end up shaking hands with the Americans at the UN later on when we switched over to their side. You had Q Sempan, who wrote a bunch of pretty intriguing academic papers in the middle of the 60s about what Cambodia could use for development that were quite moderate. And you can read them today. They kind of fit into that sort of, new revitalized Marxian economics of the time. But all of that evaporated, all that moderation and persuasion and slower paced revolutionary activity, the plans for that, they evaporated in the jungles, fighting as an insurgency. And Q Sempan emerged just as hardcore as anybody else. So it was a group of guys, but yes, they were all Paris, a lot of them were Paris trained. And sorry, remind me of the question there.
No, I was just curious as to how much it was a movement led by the masses, or at least animated by the masses, and how much it was like a personal project of these Paris-trained intellectuals.
It was an interesting arrangement. I mean, it wasn't a mass movement. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But you're coming straight out of a civil war, and so the kind of guerrilla force, which definitely drew from the villages and the peasantry, which is the base of the Khmer Rouge support, and it probably should have been. It's like that kind of bait and switch where they had all this support, but that's because they were guerrilla insurgency fighting an invader, or an invader / collaborator regime. They never had they didn't win their power by being a legitimate political force to anybody. And so, from the get-go, you have emptying the cities on really day 1 or 2 of the Khmer Rouge rule. And that was when chiefly Phnom Penh, but also other metropolitan areas, just a death march out of the cities, which they said was to protect from American bombing. That was a propaganda. Although you could understand why it was believable to people at that point.
Sure.
But tens of thousands of people died on those marches. People were, the hospitals were evacuated. The dead or the sick and ailing were just left to die on the road. Women were giving birth or who had children to support. They were out of luck, and they also died. There was very little food, and this was all a kind of rigid top-down directive from the organization, as it was called. They didn't admit themselves to be communists, which was interesting. They did not declare themselves to be a communist state until like a year and a half later or 2 years later. China kept getting them to try to get them to do it, but they were very secretive. I mean, the level of secrecy, everything you associate with a nasty revolutionary communist movement, it was like a parody of that. The secrecy, the brutality. There weren't like people's tribunals or show trials. Everything was top secret, and no one was trusted, and everyone was spied on all the time. that was something that made them very distinct.
So does this come exclusively, at least in your opinion, from both, the xenophobia, which was informed by their, historical conditions, basically everything that the Khmer and Cambodia had gone through, combined with just this relatively specific and based on what we've seen them do in the later years, kind of unhinged perspective on how a revolution is supposed to be taken through? Or was this like an actual, ideological codex that they truly believed would lead to a socialist state, or at least an independent Cambodia, et cetera, et cetera? Basically, what I'm asking is, were they kind of winging it as it was going, or was this base rooted in an actual kind of interpretation of we need to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G in order to establish a independent socialist state here in the country?
I would say, if you look at here's where we can get into a little bit of the sort of finer points of the notion of the Cambodian genocide. Because we spoke to really the foremost expert on the genocide in the West, Ben Kiernan. And to flash forward a little bit, because this is answering the question about xenophobia, obviously the worst expression of their xenophobia was in their extermination campaigns of minorities. And in fact, when people think of the Cambodian genocide, I think the shorthand means like the 1.7 million people who died, period. The thing that's interesting about that, and this is to get into the legal granular stuff. I'm not trying to actually people who want to use the term genocide to mean a bunch of people dying. But of course, genocide actually has a particular meaning. This is obviously a word that's being discussed a lot right now for obvious reasons. And the fold in this is that the majority of the victims of the Khmer Rouge were fellow Khmers of the 1.7 million, because it was that was the majority population, and many of them died. The Khmer Rouge were not out, of course, to exterminate the Khmer race. In fact, they wanted to double the population of Khmers. They certainly didn't kill anyone for the crime of being Khmer, in the way that if you look at other genocides, you were killed for being a Jew, killed for being a Croatian, or a Bosniak or a Serb or whatever, killed for being a Kurd. Obviously, the Khmer Rouge were not doing that to fellow Khmers for that reason. They killed hundreds of thousands of their fellow Khmers because they were politically suspect to the Khmer Rouge, or insufficiently judged to be contributing to the revolution, or whatever batshit ideological category they could think up. But it was not racial. In the case of and so the UN tribunal did not find them guilty of genocide against fellow Khmers, which again was the largest number of people dead. The genocides, as I find to be, a persuasive argument, and what the UN tribunal found, were against the ethnic Vietnamese in the country, which were almost completely exterminated. The tribunal did not actually judge this to be a genocide, maybe for a lack of paper trail, but the ethnic Chinese and the Muslim Chams, which was an ethnic and religious distinct population. They were not non-Khmers. These were judged to be genocide by Ben Kiernan and then the tribunal itself. And so the question of, was this a program that was prearranged, or were they just winging it? I think actually, much like the pro-American government that they overthrew, which also carried out pogroms and mass deportations of ethnic Vietnamese, they started with deportation. It's not dissimilar to the Nazis. They started with deportations and discrimination, and it evolved very quickly into a project of extermination. And they had this, as you guys said, they had this bitterness and xenophobia before they ever took power. And I think they just began to view the leveling of society socioeconomically as the same thing as leveling it culturally. And that then was a small step to say, all of these Vietnamese in our country are agents of Vietnam anyway. They're all enemy agents, so they all need to go. And all of these Chams, these Muslim Chams, they are either also working for Vietnam. A lot of Khmers were said to work for Vietnam, but it was clear that the minority population was suspect on a level that was immediate rather than the kind of negotiation you could have with someone who may or may not be betraying you as a fellow Khmer. So I think it was a program that occurred to them very quickly to undertake. And yeah, it was a racist regime. But in that, it shared, ironically, many characteristics with the anti-communist government that preceded it, whose killings of Vietnamese, which were many in the thousands, did not end up as part of the Genocide Tribunal at the UN, nor, of course, did the American actions in the years before, which killed hundreds of thousands. That did not end up discussed. It was a firmly kind of cordoned off period of time, probably the most deadly and horrendous, but a firmly cordoned off period of time that was just Khmer Rouge activity.
So zooming back out to a more geopolitical scale of that distrust, this kind of came to a head in the latter half of the 70s. Why was Cambodian leadership so spooked by Vietnamese communists? What would have been the problem with, their perception that, Vietnam's going to lead an Indo-Chinese federation? Why would that be a bad thing for Cambodia?
Well, at that point, I mean, the Indo-Chinese versus, Cambodian party thing had happened back in the day. And actually it's just absolute minutia that we don't need to go into, but one of the most deadly academic disputes ever was in the Khmer Rouge over when the party was technically founded. Do you date it to when we did this little program in a train car in the 60s, or do you date it back to when the Indo-Chinese Federation or the Indo-Chinese Party was created back in the day? And if it's the latter, you answered wrong. You're going to the killing fields. So
wow.
I mean, that's the level here. I mean, I guess at the heights of Stalin in the 30s, you could end up dead for something like that. But like they were, that was just the whole 3 or 4 years of their rule.
Sure, yeah.
The thing is that after the Vietnam War, Vietnam was struggling. It was economically, it was poverty stricken. It was in trouble. And then you see a lot of desperate moves. By the way, discrimination in Vietnam, or perceived discrimination against the Chinese minority in Vietnam, which was causing bad blood, although there was already bad blood between China and Vietnam. The Vietnamese argument was they were trying to make everybody citizens, which the ethnic Chinese in Vietnam kind of had this like best of both worlds thing where they had the doors were open to both China and Vietnam. Vietnam had just unified the country. Their argument was they were consolidating their idea of civic identity. But this led to a bunch of disputes with China. And the Sino-Soviet split is a huge part of all of this as well, which we may or may not have time to go into. The idea is that Vietnam, however much of a basket case it was economically after the war, it was now, besides China, the strongest military force in the neighborhood. It was an immensely, powerful military compared to everyone around it. Again, except for China by raw numbers. And the decades-long paranoia about Vietnam, now seeing them as this leader, this military leader who had bested the imperial power, is now a reason. They used to be collaborating, the Khmer Rouge and the Viet Cong. Now it was a cause for concern. But the Vietnamese, so far as the evidence shows, they really had no plans to take over Cambodia. They were busy enough getting their own house in order. And it was really the Khmer Rouge actions in 77 onward where they began to actually, in the opinion of Elizabeth Becker, an incredibly accomplished journalist we got to interview for the show, who lived there and had an assassination attempt against her while she was with the Khmer Rouge. It's a great story that we tell and she tells. She says that the Khmer Rouge, things were going so poorly, despite all of their optimistic graphs and calculations with how they were running their slave state, that they needed an enemy to mobilize the population at that point. And they were willing to take on another war. These were guys who felt invincible as a small vanguard party who, did beat the Americans with a lot of Viet Cong help. And so they said, we can take Vietnam. I think there was a genuine fanaticism that was honest there. Pol Pot would say, Vietnam's population was like 5 times that of Cambodia. Maybe I'd have to double check the ratio. But like he said, if one of our guys kills 5 Vietnamese, we'll kill millions of them. And so they started
but the fighting grounds aren't the same like the killing fields, you stupid fuck. Yeah, but whatever. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like how the mob your average mafia guy is a terrible shot. You know, he's really good at walking up to someone and then executing them during like a poker game, but his fat ass is going to run down the street just waving the gun wildly if he actually has to knock somebody off from long range. So yeah, I mean, it was not a real contest once the Khmer Rouge, we talked to some people in the villages. We went to the villages on the border where the Khmer Rouge began to do massacres against Vietnamese because, again, they're killing so many ethnic Vietnamese within their own borders. This was the same enemy to them. It was like the international Vietnamese, you know, the international Jew. You know, it was, I'm not sure. People make a lot of the Nazi Khmer Rouge comparison. I don't want to get too sloppy with it because they're obviously deeply different political entities, but there's some stuff that stands out to you at a certain moment. And they did massacres across the border. And eventually the Vietnamese said, you know, we're sick of this and it's going to get worse. And they started to mobilize. And that was as they were trying to negotiate, which is a real fascinating part of this season, trying to negotiate normal relations with America that America wouldn't quite give them, even though it was Jimmy Carter and he wanted to do like, you know, the reign of good vibes. There was a lot of bullshit about MIAs and POWs and reparations, with which Nixon had promised to Vietnam that America never actually wanted to deliver because Nixon was gone at that point. And the Vietnamese, maybe to a fault, not that they didn't have a claim to it, but maybe to a fault, they just would not agree to anything until the Americans coughed up those reparations, and it didn't happen. So by the time it was go time with Pol Pot next door, Vietnam fully signed on to the Soviet camp, and that made them an enemy of China. It's a lot to track, but that's the geopolitical like shit going on there, you know.
So to wrap up a bit about the war specifically, the Khmer got their teeth kicked in what, 2 weeks once Vietnam said, all right, we're rolling up our sleeves?
It took about 2 weeks for the Vietnamese to roll into Phnom Penh. There was an insurgency there for about a decade, which was supported by the United States, Thailand, and China, and the People's Republic of China. That's so because it was a, and then by the way, China invaded Vietnam.
Yeah.
In February. After the Vietnamese had just invaded.
Why do us
Cambodia.
Balkan fucks always get all the like bad shit? Oh my God, you always just fight your neighbor. You're fucking stupid, even though you're on the same side, basically. And you know,
at that
you look
point,
at this part of Asia, same thing happens. Everywhere it fucking happens. I'm just you know, doing a vibe check to an extent. You know, you see, learn some fucking history. Everywhere it happens. It's not our genetics isn't like brain broken or something. It's you know, just a part of. The eternal re-roll of systems which lead to interstate conflicts to kind of cool things down back home, et cetera, other reasons as well. But you get my point. Yeah, just
I mean,
small
at that point,
small vent.
At that point, of course, the Chinese could. I mean, they had shaken hands with Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. You know, they had both agreed. This is another part of the show we try to give as much airtime as possible. That was a huge shift. You know, Nixon and Kissinger. I know it's like the knee-jerk kind of meme of like they represented everything evil and blah blah blah, and I'm not about to launch into some kind of defense of Nixon and Kissinger as people, but like it's a little bit more complicated, honestly. Like there's a lot of different angles about what was it like. For example, and what I mean by that is in China, Kissinger is officially celebrated.
Yeah,
you know, when he died. And I had a friend who was like, yeah, the person I work with in the office is from China. She's like, isn't that just the guy who made peace with China? Like,
wow.
Now to a Cambodian or a Vietnamese person, it's a different story entirely. But
yeah,
you know, this was a very bold political move that Kissinger and Nixon made to buck Nixon's own political constituency from way back, which was the China lobby, the anti-communist China lobby. I mean, at that point, the United States was far less of an enemy in the leadership of the PRC in their eyes than the Soviet Union was. And so Vietnam, therefore, was a complete puppet in their eyes of the Soviet Union. So they would not say they were on the same side whatsoever. And in fact, the Vietnamese saw everything bad happening as some saw everything bad happening as a grand plan by China. And Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge kind of got the best. They got their legitimacy from these toxic fumes of inter-Asian communist belligerence. And the war itself, yes, it only lasted 2 weeks, but for the rest of the decade, we kept the Khmer Rouge as the official seat of Cambodia at the UN. We, no matter what Americans said, we obviously funded them and gave them arms through a coalition. It was kind of like, you like a credit default swap. You slide it into a tranche and no one knows where the money is. China was more open about about supporting the Khmer Rouge, but that was the work of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the same guy who cooked up the Mujahideen. The Khmer Rouge were really our Mujahideen in Asia, in a different part of Asia. So that war lasted a long time, and there was a demonization and an international campaign against Vietnam for kicking out Pol Pot. We prevented aid from getting into Cambodia during a famine or famine conditions. We went against them diplomatically, everything. And, the Vietnamese had their own problems, the boat people, et cetera. But it's kind of amazing when you look back at it. There was a op-ed in the New York Times that said, Pol Pot, this is in 1990, Pol Pot, brutal, yes, but no mass murderer. And the Pol quote was, wow, the real threat to Cambodia is Vietnam.
Yeah, so I guess if we zoom out again, right, you've got all these little conflicts going on and stuff. In the background of this, you have the struggle of the titans between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. So tell us a little bit more about the Sino-Soviet tension there and the split and how that influenced all of these smaller conflicts in the region.
Kissinger called them gray areas when he was still, I think he was doing his doctorate. The killing fields of the Cold War beyond Cambodia, right. The places where, all these places where we did shenanigans. It began during the Khrushchev period, around Taiwan. It wasn't a real conflict. It was just this sort of, these motions China was making toward Taiwan, and the Soviets kind of raised their eyebrow like, what the fuck are you doing? Because there was a real conservative foreign policy the Soviets were pursuing at that time.
Yeah.
And so what you get is this era of Khrushchev, despite his brass balls sending nukes to Cuba, Khrushchev was viewed as a conciliatory presence with the West because of peaceful coexistence. I'm sure you guys have discussed this at some point on the show.
Yeah.
And the Chinese at that point were the ideological scolds, of we need to, this is revisionism, Khrushchev is a revisionist, blah, blah, blah. And that the Soviets start pulling out advisors. They start pulling out, they leave, the Chinese perceived that the Soviets making a test ban treaty with America was leaving China out of the nuclear club. And China's like, we're an emerging third world revolution, and you're telling us we can't have nukes. Why did the second world and the first world get nukes and we don't? Grievances on both sides starts to devolve, whereas the Soviets are saying the Chinese are a bunch of loonies. The Chinese are calling the Soviets a bunch of social fascists, and social imperialists, right? Now, in the 70s, under the Brezhnev, Kosygin era, and then Brezhnev era, the Soviet Union makes a big turn away from peaceful coexistence into a much more revolutionary foreign policy. They're funding the PLO. They're funding with the Cubans. They're fighting in Angola, or they're supporting Angola and conflicts in Africa, Latin America. And there's a real flip of the script where then it's China. They're both competing for the leadership of the third world, both in their kind of chauvinistic ways. Now it's China eventually that's starting to lose the legitimacy of the Afro-Asian states. The African Asian states used to be called Afro-Asian. And the congresses that would happen about like, who's got the mantle? Are you going with the Chinese or the Soviets? Well, eventually it's the Soviets who start to get the cred. And they give even more money to Vietnam and support and military hardware to Vietnam. China's starting to not like Vietnam at much at the same time. And they start embracing no longer the strict ideologically approved, governments. Haile Selassie, Mobutu from Zaire, and the Shah of Iran. And that is how you get China going in, not only with the Khmer Rouge in the United States, but also the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen trained with the Chinese. And actually, the stuff you talk about today with Xinjiang and all this other stuff, there's a lot of interesting history about the intrigue around China's involvement with the Mujahideen and playing with Islamic radical politics. So this is all to say, they not only recognize Pinochet, after the coup against Allende. The PRC recognizes Pinochet,
Yeah.
which people hold their nose at in the socialist world. They also go in on the Angolan War on the side of the CIA and the South African apartheid regime against the MPLA, which was the Soviet and Cuban-backed socialist party in Angola. So this means that with all that going on, especially under Deng Xiaoping, that Vietnam is a common enemy, essentially, between the United States, which got its ass kicked by Vietnam several years ago and was trying to punish them forever after, and China, which, as Deng Xiaoping said before, China briefly invaded. It was always supposed to be a kind of quick thing where they'd go in and pull back. He said, we need to teach them a lesson. That was what he kind of like, almost like called it a, like if there were a German word for that, it would be, that was the nature of the invasion.
Yeah.
It was like a teach you a lesson invasion, and ironically, by the end of the Vietnamese occupation, they just unilaterally pulled out of Cambodia, which was right around the time that the Soviet Union, which was at that point kind of a decaying liberal government under Gorbachev, makes nice with the Chinese. Everyone's kind of coming together, Tiananmen Square. It's a little uncomfortable, but then everyone's kind of shaking hands, and you're in the end of history all of a sudden. But the Khmer Rouge are still an insurgency throughout the 1990s until around the time Pol Pot dies in the late 90s, and then you get the genocide, a very slow and painful process of finally getting a genocide tribunal set up against the surviving members, which probably could have happened earlier. But the United States and the West, and of course China, did not want Pol Pot to be captured, so there was no action taken because we were still supporting him.
All right. Well, that just about brings us to the hour mark, Brendan. Before we let you go, for anybody who's still on the fence about listening to Season 5, just give us your elevator pitch for why this period is so interesting and critical.
The easiest elevator pitch would be to watch the trailer by Ben Clarkson that we dropped just before the season came out. It's wonderful. I did the music with Dan Beckner from Wolf Parade and Operators, but also Ben is a true artist, and it's a great little horror short that gets at some of the ideas in this season. But I would say the way I've thought about it a bit is, apart from everything we've already talked about, this kind of widening of the scope of the Vietnam War and looking at all these different ways. We could have done a whole season on Laos, by the way, but you got to pick your battles, so to speak. The Chinese relationship with America. I think it's the neglected other side of the collapse of international communism, such as it was. Everyone thinks about the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, etc. But there's this Asian communism, Red Brotherhood in Asia, as it was called in one book, that really dies around the same time with this infighting. And it's not that the West and the U.S. are not involved; they're really a driver of it in a lot of ways. But there's also, of course, as people like to scold you, there's agency in these communist countries they have beefs with each other all on their own. And only like 15 years before, China, the Soviet Union, Vietnam were all on the same side. And then you get the Sino-Soviet split, okay, but then you get the split between Vietnam and Cambodia, and then the split between Vietnam and China. So I think the disillusion of that bloc, which was, of course, for many years viewed in America as one bloc, the same way the Eastern Bloc was, the Eastern Europeans, is the kind of other, the other tower, the north or south tower of the WTC in the collapse.
The other wall.
Yeah, the other wall, yeah. I mean, the Chinese wall is actually still there, but, that's the other side of it that is not really recognized as such. Yeah. But it's there, and it's its own fascinating story, and depending on your politics, tragic story.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. Dear listener / viewer, if you're watching this in video, stick around. We'll put the trailer for Blowback Season 5 at the end of this episode, so you can give that a watch. By the time this comes out, you will be able to listen to the entire season. So, Brendan, tell us where people can go to find that, how they can get access and listen to Blowback Season 5.
Same as always, it should be your homepage, blowback.show. You can just press the big button that says subscribe, and you will get not only the entire season of all 10 episodes, but also an ad-free back catalog of everything else we've ever done, and 10 bonus episodes that I am feverishly trying to finish right now as we are on this call or after this call. And other goodies, including the merch run we do next time. You'll get a deal on that. You can also buy our last season's merch, which was a wonderful Metal Gear themed set of stuff. Cool. Thank you. And it's just yes, with a click of your mouse or Android or iPhone device, subscribe at blowback.show.
Absolutely, highly recommended. I can tell you, having listened to the first 4 episodes, it is a banger of a season, as always. So, Brendan, thank you again for coming on. With all that being said, we'd like to thank our patrons for listening. We love you guys. Mwah, mwah. Lots of kisses on your little noses. This has been the Deprogram. I'm JT.
I'm Ugopnik.
I am anti-revisionist, anti-social imperialist, anti-social fascist Brendan James.
Here was the situation. They were sending great numbers of troops into Cambodia, preparing for what is called the Tet Offensive of that year.
We take this action not for the purpose of expanding the war in Cambodia, but for the purpose of ending the war in Vietnam.
I do it again, I do it again, I do it again.
It's just a dead country.
We're still fighting the Vietnam War, and if we have to use the Khmer Rouge as a pawn in that, we'll use them.
I do it again, 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 I do it again.